When it comes to easy to make personalized gifts, it's harder to get more personal and easier than a ring. I'm Rob Brady and welcome to Static Woodworks. So for this project, we're going to need a ring blank. We're using Pinecone and resin for today's ring. A metal core. These are the Artisan Comfort Cores by Craft Supplies USA. You're going to need a scrap block. This is how we're going to help get the rough shape on that ring. We're going to need a ring mandrel. You've got a couple choices here. We can use these expanding mandrels here. This is what I will be using. Or if you already have a pen mandrel, you can use a pen mandrel and these specialized bushings. We're going to need some painter's tape and super glue. You will also need an appropriately sized brad point or Forstner drill bit, but we'll cover that in more detail later. And then various marking implements, such as a straight edge or a tri-square in this case, and a Sharpie or pen. And then you'll need a way to finish these rings, and we will be using the Stick Fast CA finish system today. Before we get started, the first thing we need to do is find center here. I'm going to be using this engineer square, and we're just going to draw a couple lines. Well, that's not visible. And now we have our center point. We're going to use this here to line this up on the lathe. Now that we've got our center point marked, we're going to need a way to fix this to our blank here, or rather our scrap piece. So, make sure there's no dust and debris on that. We're just going to put a piece of painter's tape here. And now, let's head over to the lathe. Before we can attach the ring blank to the scrap block, we need a flat face that is mostly perpendicular to the rotation axis. There are plenty of ways to get this. Personally, I prefer the table saw. However, I chose to use the lathe to accomplish this for the practice. Also, I'm a glutton for punishment. Use whichever method you prefer. With our scrap block flattened, we're going to put a piece of painter's tape right here. Be sure to put some CA glue down first, as this will help keep the blank from free spinning on the block. Now we put a little bit of CA glue on the back of the ring blank directly on the tape. Carefully line up the center with the tailstock, and then press it onto the scrap block. Give it a quick spritz of activator, then give it a minute or so to cure up before spinning up the lathe. Now we can knock down those edges and bring our blank to round. This is where a roughing or spindle gouge will shine. Don't worry about carving the final thickness just yet. We'll do that after we mount it on our core. And don't be afraid to stop to check your progress a few times. I've still got a flat spot here, so I'm going to turn it a little bit further. Earlier, I mentioned applying CA glue to the face of the scrap block to keep the ring blank from spinning. I hadn't done it at this point, and watch what happens. And that's why. Having sharp tools also helps with this, so don't be afraid to take your tools to the strop frequently. And with our ring blank rounded off, it's time to make our hole. Now, this next step, according to the official instructions, they recommend that you use a drill bit that is half the diameter of the ring core that you're going to be using. I'm too impatient. I'm gonna actually go up a couple sizes. So I'm gonna be using a 15/32 brad point drill bit. The brad point is important because that makes sure that you can actually get it centered on the ring blank. Make sure everything stays, well, centered. Yeah. So let's do that now. With a drill chuck installed on the tailstock, secure your chosen bit. Some ring makers prefer Forstner bits for this, as they do cut cleaner holes. Since our blank is supported by scrap material, I'm not concerned about this, so I'm using the brad point you see here. With the lathe spinning at an appropriate speed for the material, guide the drill bit into the center of the ring blank and carefully feed it through until you start to see shavings from the scrap block begin to pop out. Now, you may need to clear the drill bit out from time to time to keep an eye on your progress, as I'm doing here, but it's usually not necessary. Once you see shavings from your scrap block appear, you've traveled completely through the ring blank. Congratulations, you're done! Depending on your setup and materials, you may need to slide the entire tailstock partway through the cut if you don't have enough travel on it, but you should usually be good for a single ring core. Now that we've got a hole in here, we need to open it up. Take your time on this, as it's easy to overshoot your desired ring size. If that happens, you can just use a larger ring core fit for a different finger, or the same finger loosely. It's your ring, so make it fit how you want. Now you want to stop and check your progress frequently until you get a snug fit. Now this is close, but not quite. At this point, you could choose to use sandpaper to fine-tune the hole size if you really wanted to, but I personally try not to stick my fingers into small spinny things of death like this if I don't have to. The skew chisel works just fine. There, a perfect fit. And it only took about 15 tries to sneak up on it. Don't worry if the core won't go all the way through. As long as enough of the core is surrounded by the blank to fully cover it, you're good. Now the next step, according to the instructions, is to remove the blank with the core in place and then glue the two together. However, since my core isn't going all the way through, I'll just glue it up now. First though, we need to scuff up the outer edge in order to give the CA something to grab onto. I'm using 120 grit on a sanding block, but feel free to use anything up to 220 grit. The grit isn't too important, the point is to just give the glue a texture to hold on to. Now we apply a bead of the CA glue all around the inner wall of the ring blank. If you're using a porous wood, you may need to apply a heavier coat than I'm doing here. Next, insert the band. When you do this, you'll probably get some glue on the inner edge of the ring core. This is fine, as we can clean it up with a sharp chisel later. But to make things a bit easier, go ahead and wipe away the excess glue now. Then, let it sit for about 2 minutes. To separate the blank from the block, use a putty knife. If one is not available, you can very carefully use a chisel, as I'm doing here. In hindsight, I probably should have cleaned up the edge first. This right here is the exact reason I'm fond of blue tape over double-sided tape. As you can see, not only did it release easily, but there's no tape residue to clean up later. So, I'm going to be using the expanding ring spindles here from ringsupplies.com. These things are awesome. Not sponsored, by the way. So we are using a 6.5 size ring core. So we're going to be using the 4.5 to 8.5 expanding ring spindle here. And this just gets chucked up into a 1/2 inch chuck. Put that in there, snug that down. First, we got to secure that. Okay, we're secure. We're gonna fire up the dust collection, aka shot vac, and we're gonna start tuning this thing down to final width and then get our final shape going. Here, I'm using a spindle gouge to quickly remove a lot of material. This final ring is only 5 millimeters wide and a fraction of that thick, so there's a lot of material to remove. You could also use a roughing gouge, but just make sure it's sized appropriately to the project at hand. At hand? Get it? Because we're making a ring? Never mind. Let's just move on. Here, you can see I switched to a freshly stropped roughing gouge, and you can see just how much better this is working on this dense resin. This is also a great testament to the benefits of dust collection, as you can see much of this resin getting sucked right up as it shreds apart. Before we trim it to final thickness, we want to trim the width back to the band. For this, we will very carefully use a skew chisel. An accessory light is really great to have here, as you don't want to carve into your ring mandrel. Remember to keep the chisel moving or back it off frequently to prevent it from getting too hot. Once it's trimmed to width, switch to a smaller chisel if you have one and begin trimming to final thickness. Here I'm using a pen skew chisel. Once you've got the thickness close, you can keep using the skew chisel to get a gentle curve on the ring if you desire, or you can use a small sized spindle or roughing gouge. Here I'm using a roughing gouge meant for pens and small projects like this ring. Remember to take small cuts to sneak up on the shape and size you want, remembering that we will still be sanding, so don't go too far with the chisels.
Alright, now that we've got our shape more or less finished, it's time to sand. So I got my mask, got the skizzers, got the sanding pack. So basically we're going to start at our 150 grit to do our final shaping and clean up a little bit more glue that I've got it here on the outside. And then we're going to progress through all the grits up to 600. And then we're going to start applying our CA finish. We're going to reverse our throw here. And we're going to slow that down a bit. I don't want this resin to get too hot.
As with all sanding, keep sanding all the way through your desired grit. If you're using a wood blank for this, it's a good idea to stop the lathe and lightly sand with the grain after each grit in order to hide the sanding marks a bit better.
So now that we've gone up through 600 grit, we're just checking to see if there's any other major defects. Everything looks pretty good so far. Now we're going to switch over to the micro mesh and get this polished up nice and tight before we put the finish on. So when we are polishing the acrylic with the micro mesh, it's important that we use water as a lubricant. Otherwise you'll be going through these pretty quick. So put the rag down there and just punch that roll to the side. That's fine. There. Now you can really start to see the character coming out very quickly. What looked like it was just blue is actually a nice little array of purples and cyans and turquoise. This is beautiful. So we're going to spend the most time on our roughest pad here, which I think is about 1200 grit, because we want to make sure that there's no surface flaws before we move on. Keep that nice and wet. And polish. Making sure to get the sides. And that is why I like using this spindle here. When you use the pen mandrel, you don't have as good access to the sides, at least on these on the smaller rings. All right, I think we're ready to move on. That actually polished very quickly. And again, we're just going to wet our pad. Fire that up and polish that. And the rest of these will really take only about 15 seconds each. Alright, we are done with the micro mesh, and this looks fantastic.
At this point, since this is resin, you can call this done and move on to the next project. But if you want to put a finish on top, you can apply something like a CA finish, which we'll do now. To start, put a drop of thin CA glue on a lint-free rag, then rub it into the ring with the lathe on. Don't let it drag for more than a couple of seconds though, as this will get insanely hot very quickly and can lead to some very uncomfortable flesh meltings. Spray some activator on it, then repeat these steps with medium CA glue, applying between 3 to 10 coats.
You can see it's kind of hazy. You can see a good chunk of haze right there. So now we're going to polish it up. Back through the micro mesh. And again, make sure that you keep it wet. Alright, once we progress through all of our grits, we'll stop it. Make sure we don't need to make any more repairs or anything like that. Now I'm still working on perfecting my finishing process for these, so I'm expecting some flaws. And sure enough, there's a bit of, we'll call it etching on this side of the ring. And I got the blank a little too thin, but overall I'm very happy with how it looks. So let's go ahead and do the final polishing right now. So for this step, we need another rag, and we're gonna use these two here. We do 1 round of the satin, and then I'm gonna do 2 rounds of the gloss, depending on how it looks after those first rounds of polish. And just a little bit, it's hard to see with the lighting, but just a very small amount on the rag. Let it spin around. There we go. That's all it takes. Super easy to apply. Whoa, that was a lot. We can fix that. And move over to a dry section of the rag and polish it all off. All right, let's have a look. Oh yeah, that is pretty. Bring that off, clean off the polish. And there's the ring. Got some flaws, but that's all operator error. Overall, I'm very pleased with how that looks. Thanks for watching.